Obwohl Dürrenmatt auch sagt, je planmäßiger man vorgeht, umso wirkungsvoller trifft einen.
Okay, there are some plans that are not thwarted, but plans that can actually be implemented. So the number of participants usually dwindles on Fridays, but here we have Professor Oppenheim, Professor Schüchtern, Dr. Birk, and cyber warfare, and this means that the number of participants has not dwindled but is actually increasing. So why don't we now hand over to Mr. O'Keefe to act as facilitator. Well, thank you. Ever since the Stuxnet program in 09-10, we know that strategic capabilities can be compromised in the cyberspace. So we have learned the lesson well. Or to put it differently, state sovereignty needs to be defended in cyberspace as well. Now, cyber is nothing new. Cyber experts in the craft, well, this is not a new technique. It has been around for quite a while, in fact. Nevertheless, of course, there are changes underway. Now, in the Asian countries, and also in Latin America, as well as in the US and North America, well, there people talk about information security, and they don't really talk about cyber so much. So the use of the term depends on the geography. Cyber commands, information security departments, all of those terms are used. But cyber, of course, affects all of us, and information security affects all of us. Now, the world, of course, is becoming smaller and smaller thanks to the progress made in IT. Just think about our smartphones. Of course, I've deactivated my microphone. After all, there's live streaming. So there's a multitude of terms used, new methods and techniques that are being devised, and some operational aspects that have been around for quite a while, actually, that hark back to history. Doing things together against each other, exchanging data, and so on and so forth. Well, what about the Munich Security Report that was published this year? After the Munich Security Conference, well, 10 political risks were mapped for 2018. What's quite interesting is that 5 out of these 10 actually deal with information security. Number 1, China, as well as the change of the global business environment. So there are many areas that are undergoing profound change. So it's about an exchange of information, and not really about classical industry. Number 2, competition cyberspace. Well, this brings us to the nitty-gritty. That's the term, that's the narrative, as well as the title of our panel. And then number 3, global tech Cold War. Well, what does an exchange of technology involve? Well, gaining, acquiring information. 6 and 7, well, 6 talks about an erosion of institutions, and this results in the following question. So we have a new space, we're venturing into a new space, we need rules, we need authorities that help us find guidance. I don't like to talk about security at this point, but just orientation or guidance. The Munich Security Report, I've just mentioned it. Well, in the Asian countries, people don't really know much about the Munich Security Conference, so maybe they need some other kind of guidance or orientation. And then 7, barriers in the digital economy. These barriers are shifted, they're recreated, they emerge. So, the pillars of international order and security, long taken for granted, have come under increasing pressure. So this affects all of us, business-wise, in the area of culture, and also it affects us as individuals, as well as in the military area. So what does cyber mean for military operations? Well, there are a lot of varieties. So let me talk about those notions. it depends really on how things are put into practice operationally. The US have a cyber command, a strategic cyber command, but as far as operations go, they just opened the 10th fleet. I have a Navy background. So they invested in the physical fleets, and then suddenly there's a 10th fleet, but they have no ship, they just have personnel and a lot of computers. Well, this means that within this fleet, you've got working groups that actually aboard the ships, and tactically speaking, they support the other fleets. So here you have the strategic, the tactical, the operational levels, and the system is, or begs the question, what's the strategy? And then there are other countries, such as Germany. You also have a cyber command here. But actually, things got started just 1 year ago. And in the next 4 years, human resources will be built up. Asian countries, China, well, they have a completely different approach. They have a top-notch cyber command, and they operate at all levels, not just down at the tactical level. So this is to give you guidance in terms of how we can put things into context. And this is my personal viewpoint as well. Cyber actually supports the classical areas. So state sovereignty is not just based on the territory. Cyber influences a lot our survival, but the national borders, of course, can't really be changed by cyber. That's what the other areas can do. Well, I don't want to be too long in this introduction, so let me come to the next question. What can we do to find guidance and to face those threats, to contain those threats and those narratives that exist are multifold? Well, these are the buzzwords that you see here. This is a manual, by the way, that contains all the buzzwords that help you find guidance. Even experts in this area focus on specific areas and disregard others. But this is also true for the classical areas. You can't capture everything. You always look for guidance, just like in the Navy and in other areas. So education, communication, and raising awareness. It's very important to talk about this. Now, we do have the cyberspace. It's here, but we do not know its topography. We don't know where the mountains, the lakes, the rivers are. Where should we actually station our troops? How can we make sure that there is state sovereignty? Well, we're starting to see things for our societies. Now, we have a very mixed panel here, different perspectives, in other words. We've got the Cyber Command perspective, the Austrian perspective, then we also have the civilian sector perspective, then we have another vantage point, blockchains. Well, blockchains are used in cyber defense, IT security. It's considered a panacea, a solution to all of our problems. Anja Blasch, hopefully, will demystify this panacea notion. And then we also have legal aspects represented here. Thank you, Ms. Fröhlich, for talking about this. And then self-defense in cyberspace. And conclusions drawn by Hermans. Mr. Hermans. Walter Unger is the first speaker. From 01 to 09, he was head of the counterintelligence division of the Austrian army. Then from 06 to 08, he was head of the interministerial working group on ICT security. Since 2017, he has been head of the Cyber Defense Center of the Austrian army. And we're starting off with you. So how about sharing the military perspective with us? Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Those who know me know that I love talking about my favorite issue, especially when talking to so many experts. Now, 2010, Stuxnet, that was a wake-up call, not only for the operators of large-scale industrial plants, because they always said that industrial control systems, well, they always said it's proprietary systems that can't be attacked. Well, Stuxnet, this proved to us that this was actually possible, because the Iranian systems had actually been disconnected and had not been reached by hackers. So, policymakers said we need to come up with a strategy. It's become a big issue. It's become a very, very important issue. So we need to devise a strategy. A process was triggered involving several ministries. New life was breathed into this process, and this process is a work in progress. It's not been finalized. So the $64,000 question is, when will you have full operational capability? When will you achieve this? And we always reply, we don't know, because we don't know what the future of technologies will look like and how this will impact our security. Now, ladies and gentlemen, so we face a lot of headwind, and there are major challenges underway. There's a strategic dimension that we need to consider. But of course, you can also sail against the wind, even though things may not work all that well. So I would like to briefly talk about technological developments. Now you have to internalize them so that you understand the threat scenarios. We need to take a look at the scenario. What does a cyber attack actually look like that would threaten or that could jeopardize Austria's sovereignty? And lastly, I'd like to talk about how Austria respond. What has Austria done so far, and what does the future hold in store for us? Now, just think about technological developments. Well, these developments, of course, are dominated by the buzzwords that have already been mentioned. The Internet of Everything, well, that is clearly emerging. Well, we have 4 billion people that have access to the Internet right now. 400 million, that's the annual increase. Soon we'll have 5 billion in 2 years. We have 10 billion devices that have an IP address. While the CEO of Infineon Austria says that by 2025 we'll have 50 billion connected devices. So Industry 4.0, robots, UAVs, drones, blockchain technologies, artificial intelligence, the use and exploitation of huge quantities of data that's generated, processing that takes place in clouds, mobility, well, all of these things that are interconnected, well, all of these things, of course, want to communicate with computers, with other devices. So we need to have higher transmission rates. 5G will be subject to a tender process, and things might be finalized by 2025, which means that data transmission will increase 100-fold. 10 megabit, well, that's what we currently have. We'll have 10 gigabyte in the future. So, or gigabit. So just think about self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles. Well, they, of course, communicate all the time with certain devices. But it's not just those vehicles. Any run-of-the-mill car is connected to servers, to the body shops in the vicinity. What are then the consequences of these developments? Well, these technologies are disruptive. They impair our business models and the way we work with each other, the way society evolves. We're talking about millions of jobs that may become lost because of these new technologies that have already become lost. And then, at the same time, a lot of other jobs are created in other areas, and we can't fill all those vacancies right now. So there is a transformation going on in the world of employment. Dramatic developments are taking place. There is a fair amount of automation. Wherever automation is possible, computer programs, robots, UAVs will actually do the job and oust humans. There are many areas that could be mentioned. In the next 7 years, more than 7 million jobs will be lost in Germany. And I'm not talking about low-skilled labor. I'm talking about the medium level and even the upper levels where people will actually be replaced by computers. Another consequence of this connectedness that we're seeing, this connectivity, especially mobile connectivity, well, will be fully dependent on these systems. Now, some of you may already live in a smart home that they open up with their smartphone. You can actually close your windows or switch on the heating by using your smartphone. Well, what if your smartphones don't work anymore? Well, you can't just enter your building, your home. Or just think about safety and security. Well, that is still quite important. Now, in future, burglars may simply hack your systems, and they may just open up your doors, the garage door, your terrace door, whatever, and you don't see any traces. So if you add it all up, you will realize that security is of high strategic importance. So we're fully dependent on these systems. We need those systems, and that's why security is very, very important.
Now let's take a look at the threat. We have viruses, worms. Those are things that we dealt with in the 90s, but now the security risk has dramatically increased. Today, for example, there are 500,000 new signatures of malware every day. At the same time, what we're seeing is the software that we all need, unfortunately, is not fault-free. Even the German BSI or the American NIST, they are looking into this. And you can look at the catalog of what weak points and soft spots they identify every day, sometimes even dramatic weak points. And there are some evil people who are doing exactly the same thing. Well, they don't publish the fact that there are weak points, they just use it for their own purposes. We, from the military, we are working with these threats. So there's threats against individuals, the user, and the abuse of personal data based on methods of predictive analysis. Then there's cybercrime, a large field where it's only about enriching oneself. In Austria, there are only 36 bank robberies per year. This used to be a lot more. Well, the cause is that the criminals have found out that it's less dangerous to rob a bank via a hack rather than going there physically. Or companies are confronted with phishing attacks or blackmail attacks, and they have to pay, well, ransom money because of ransomware attacks. So last year, for example, and this really hurts, British hospitals can't perform surgeries anymore because they no longer have access to patient data because the data has been encrypted by malware. The consequence being that they also need to pay a ransom to be able to start operating again. Then there's business espionage. And of course, it is much cheaper to steal a secret, a business secret, rather than developing this yourself. This is also criminal business, but this is so important, so huge, that we need to underline it. In Austria, the losses are 1.5 to 2 billion, and in Germany, the loss is 20 to 50 billion per year. And that, of course, has reached a dimension at the macroeconomic scale that we shouldn't underrate. And at the top level, we know that terrorists use these new ways and means for what they've always been doing, namely to spread propaganda in order to, for example, spread operating instructions how to build bombs, or to do training or to prepare and discuss attacks. So all of that is, of course, much more comfortable with the new cyber world, and you can do it across the globe. And it gets really terrible when you see that terrorists are trying to focus on the weak points of power plants, of nuclear power plants. So in future, it is conceivable to see attacks that would lead to serious damage. And at the top, we have digital standstill. What applies to Austria is that we really depend on the information and communication technologies to work. Now, if somebody were to attack the state and the critical infrastructure of the state in a concentrated fashion, this could lead to digital standstill with serious consequences. The sovereignty of Austria might be at risk. So such an attack would, of course, come from a political motive. You want to achieve a political objective, and you do that by means of cyber war. Now, is it conceivable? Does it work? For Austria, it might work. It would work because we are highly dependent on our critical infrastructure, and that in turn depends on ICT, and an attack might be successful. How would such a scenario look? Let's take a look at this chart. Here you see the essential critical infrastructure listed, and that applies to all countries. What isn't on this list is nuclear power plants, but we might have a problem if the nuclear power plants near our borders were to be attacked, and this might lead to a meltdown, as we've seen for Chernobyl. Chernobyl is more than 1,000 kilometers away, and still this led to major damage here too. So is it feasible? From power supply all the way to the emergency units, that everything can be attacked simultaneously? We are afraid so, because there are lots and lots of means and methods. They exist out there, and I guess there are also some that they have in their labs that are not yet known. As for Stuxnet, well, of course, they tried and tested Stuxnet first, and only when they knew that exactly those systems would be attacked and no others, it is only then that it was infiltrated into those plants. Now, the time needed for that, well, it's not too long if you prepare such a strategic coup. It doesn't really require a lot of finances. Just imagine a good battle helicopter gunship will cost more than 10 million euros by way of comparison. And then you don't really need a lot of personnel in terms of the number of heads, but of course the quality needs to be right, otherwise it won't work. Now, by way of summary, we can say that we are dependent on this critical infrastructure. Unfortunately, they all have some weak points. Even IT professors are saying it is impossible to have fault-free software. It's not possible. The programs are getting more and more complex, and just consider for 1,000 lines of code, there are maybe 3 to 5 bugs, weak points. And a self-driving car, what do you think, how many lines of programming are needed? 100 million for a self-driving car. So a passenger plane with 6 million isn't a lot by way of comparison. But of course, there's a lot of weak spots there. So the consequence is that we need to defend ourselves. Now, what options does a state have in order to counteract this strategic threat? Well, the first option is prevention through deterrence and prevention. Another option would be, to prevent them to be able to reach their political goal. Then damage limitation and the ability to quickly recover all the structures. Now, deterrence, a small country such as Austria is probably not going to be very deterrent. Now, just remember, one US president once said, if somebody were to attack our strategic infrastructure, we reserve the right to strike back with all means, not just with cyber means, but with everything in our arsenal. For a small state, this isn't an option, so we need to go down a different road. Option 3 and 4, that means that large damage is simply accepted and tolerated, well, somebody's going to have to foot the bills, so this will be at the expense of our prosperity. So logically, what remains is option 2. We need to prevent the attacker from achieving his political goals. We need to remain sovereign, and we need to minimize the damage. In order to achieve this end, based on the Austrian security strategy, we developed an Austrian cyber strategy. And in 2013, this was passed, and the strategy says we need a security control board that has been established, and it monitors the building up of all other defense mechanisms. Now, in the operative field, we have founded a coordinating group, and this has been set up, and it is working together quite well. And it covers several ministries. There's this Ministry of the Interior that is in charge of all of these things at times of peace, then the National Defense Ministry and the government. Now, the crisis management has been established, so the existing state crisis management is expanded by a cyber element. So we have also consulted cyber experts, because if a hacker were to, for example, shut down our power supply, we have a power supply crisis, not just a hacker crisis. So the crisis management is going to have to act to keep the damage for the population to a minimum. The protection of critical infrastructure also requires a legal foundation. What helps, on the one hand, is the general data protection regulations, even though it primarily protects personal rights to privacy. And in parallel, the network and information technology law was developed. And this law is now ready for a review in Parliament. It's a bit behind the EU schedule, because on the 9th of May it should have been passed and come into force, but I'm confident that it will be passed by Parliament in the near future. Now, these laws contain obligations for critical infrastructure, what level of security you need to reach, standards are defined, who will audit that, and what happens if the standards are not reached. And the last important component of strategy is a platform that facilitates cooperation between authorities and business. Basically, the business circles are really ready to be highly committed. A lot of companies have contributed, for example, when it comes to the development of the NIST law. Since strategy hasn't really matured and aged, it's not obsolete. A lot of things have been dealt with, and the others are still valid. So since autumn of this year, we've been evaluating our strategy. The expert draft will soon be finished. The military part is already done. And then the political component will be dealt with. And we expect a new strategy this year. So it's about developing further what we already have. So this is a never-ending process. Now, what about responsibilities in Austria? Well, this was discussed at length. Then we looked at facts, and it became clear that all incidents, all the way up to crises, are within the responsibility of the Ministry of the Interior. So the strategic reserve, the Austrian army, can be used for assistance. This happens every day at the borders, during natural disasters. It would also be possible in the cyber field. And if there are any attacks against the sovereignty of Austria, this would be a case for the Ministry of Defense to take over. So what have the military done so far? We have three main players in this scenario. On the one hand, the Cyber Defense Command, headquartered here. The main task is to make sure that all systems of the army are protected. Just imagine we have 36,000 devices with their own networks behind them, and we have soldiers in 36 countries in the world, small missions in Afghanistan, Mali, and major missions on the Balkans. And we always need, of course, secure communication with them. Every year we have an exercise to ensure the safety of our airspace above Vorarlberg and Tyrol when the leaders of business and politics meet in Geneva. So a lot of work, and to safely operate these centers, the cyber defense system talks about what this means for us, not only protecting the military, but the entire country. We are also an intelligence service, so every day we issue a report about the situation, and at regular intervals we provide reports. Everything that is needed for other authorities is coordinated by our inner circle, and we are the only element that is currently authorized to build up active components. So we are working out the legal basis, so it's clear what's done within Austria, and what we are allowed to do at the transnational level is currently being discussed by lawyers. And we also have the military intelligence service that provides situation reports also for our cyber report. Now, along those lines, that's my introduction to our panel. Thank you. Dear Colonel, thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you for the insights in terms of what the threats are from the perspective of a nation, and thank you for showing up some of the potential solutions. So Austria, to me, is an example of how the situation can be quickly analyzed and how we can find ways to control the situation. I think it's good that you can never be 100% sure, and you stated that. So even in cyberspace, we can never have 100% security and safety. So it's important to have more risk management rather than building high walls. This is why I'm looking forward to the next presentation. That's the business perspective. Let's take a look at how they handle risk management and how they deal with those threats. Morning. Thank you for the invitation. When Patrick contacted me a couple of weeks ago that he would be facilitating a panel on cyber and security, I thought, well, long time no see. Last time I was in Vienna, I was in the State Department, then back to the airport. And this is why, on very short notice, he asked me whether I wanted to participate in this panel. And even if this isn't really what I'm accustomed to, because I'm more of an engineer, a technician, but it is very interesting to see how the military are dealing with this subject matter of cyber and cyber war and cyber crime. Now, we have 4 buzzwords that we're supposed to talk about, and also the question that results from that, whether it's just old wine in new skins, or whether actually there's something entirely new. So I thought up something for each of these areas. So on the one hand, I had to look up some of these terms, I have to admit. In this case, for example, resilience, I knew this from physics. So apparently, in this case, it means that a system is capable of organizing itself and of recovering if it is attacked without requiring any outside efforts. So the system needs to be stable within itself, inherently stable. And I believe this is something that I also saw in the field of the military, and this hasn't changed in the cyber world either. Then hybridity. Well, in this case, we're talking about hybridity, which is a combination and a chain of things. So in the military dimension, it's different troops that work together. And of course, this has changed in recent years because this no longer depends on how many soldiers you have or what kind of weapons you have. You can actually work with a very small group and create a lot of havoc and damage. And then we move on to the narrative. Dr. Birk used the concept a bit differently than I'm familiar with. So the way I know the narrative is it's a story, a narration, a story that is being told. And I therefore thought that in this case it's about how to change a story, how to create alternative truths. So a lot has changed in recent years. In the past 2 years, with the re-emergence of artificial intelligence, even though we had artificial intelligence 10 or 20 years ago, but now we have the means and the computer capacity to make these systems self-learning systems. And therefore we can no longer differentiate whether we're talking about a man or a machine or talking to a man or machine. So 80% of all sports coverage is no longer written by people, but is actually written by robots. And in recent weeks you may have seen the show of Google Duplex, where an instruction was given to a cell phone. Well, make an appointment with my hairdresser. So the system called the hairdresser, and the person at the other end, well, they agreed an appointment without this person at the hairdresser salon to find out that it was a machine. So actually I also told my relatives and my acquaintances about this, and about 60% of people didn't realize who is a machine and who's a person. So what this means is that you can create facts that have nothing to do with reality. This also applies to video processing. And now we can replace individuals or voices, and now it's getting interesting to find out what is the truth. We had a war correspondent here, and I found this very interesting. Unfortunately, I couldn't ask my question. How does he make sure that his identity wasn't usurped by somebody, identity theft, and somebody reports on his behalf? Because I think that now you can't make sure that this doesn't happen. So this brings us to the last concept, namely cyber. I think cyber was the word of the year in 1994, so it's not quite new. Since that time it is often used, or mostly used, by non-engineers. So everything that is somehow related to computers falls under the general denomination of cyber. But I think we can live with that because it is actually the root cause for all changes to the other concepts that I mentioned before. So to come back to the question of whether this is old wine in new skins, yes, some of it is. The cloud, for example, is really old. But everything that has anything to do with artificial intelligence or blockchain which is something we're going to discuss in the following. Well, this is definitely new. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my presentation. I would like to hand over to Patrick. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you for giving us insights into the perspective of the non-cyber world, the information security world. Well, I'm pleased that you're here because I appreciate having a bilateral dialogue with you. You can provide us with wonderful insights in this field, and I can only warmly recommend that you talk to him because he has reports from banking and from the civilian sector, so things are happening that we are still talking about at the theoretical level. Now, in order to move on to the next subject, this takes me to Ms. Anja Blaj. She works for a blockchain think tank. Well, this is a think tank of people who are experts in the area of blockchain. Blockchains are used in order to secure data in a form that makes sure that the stored information, whether it's currency or other data, cannot be attacked or modified based on given current methods. So we'll hear more details about this and also the demystification. So we shouldn't think that this is the solution for all our worries. It's just one part of risk management that can be covered by blockchain, but not everything. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you for the presentation, Patrick. As said, my name is Anja Blaj, and I do work for a blockchain think tank. It's been a year, half a year right now, and what think tank actually does is it presents a bridge between the industry, so between all the projects that are willing to use the blockchain technology and the regulators on the other side. Because it became quite clear that the technology is disrupting the whole industry, the whole financial sector, and that some sort of regulation are necessary to introduce. So what we do is trying to find some sort of solutions, trying to present some new guidelines, not really laws, but this is what we basically do. I have a disclaimer to make. So first of all, I'm a lawyer. I'm not really a technician. I'm not a developer. So when it comes to the basics of how blockchain works, I advise you to find a technician because I won't provide any specific answers to that. And the second disclaimer is that my PowerPoint does not include any pictures, so it might be boring to some of you. About the crypto assets. As presented before, we actually have been introduced to the internet for quite a while now. It's been here before I was even born, and it tremendously changed how we live. So we are aware that we are having a lot of digital assets already. We have telephone numbers, we have data being introduced on internet, it's being collected in clouds. So we are operating in a virtual world already. We are talking about the cyber domain, so we are legally looking at it just the same as we saw the land, the sea, and the airspace. Now we are talking about the virtual space as well. Being aware that there were digital assets before, it was pretty much the financial crisis that introduced the idea of blockchain. So it was basically just an answer to what we could achieve with the technology that we have today. And what it introduced was the cryptography. So having anonymous actors participating in a network and just collecting, recording the transactions on this network was kind of a new idea, and it still is a new idea. So having crypto assets, it actually means that we have the encrypted communication using private and public keys. So when it comes to blockchain, one of the things that needs to be distinguished is we can talk about blockchains, different blockchains, or distributed ledger technologies. What it actually means, I mean, the name introduces itself already. It is a new narrative, I guess. Although when it comes to new narratives, I'm now becoming aware that we are basing the new narratives on a lot of buzzwords. I mean, not only artificial intelligence, but also the blockchain. It's been a hype, and the hype was achieved probably with Bitcoin reaching $10,000. That's when everybody became aware of it, because usually when we talk with cyber people, it's about Bitcoin being used for, when data is locked, and then a hacker wants to get some Bitcoins back. So they unlock the data. But it's one of the things that we have to face when dealing with the virtual world. It's just like the emergence of internet. All of a sudden, we didn't really have just the records in paper. We also had the papers on the internet, which could easily be accessed by whomever knows the technology well. And it's the same with distributed ledger technologies, or at least the Bitcoin. What are the characteristics that might help the cybersecurity is that they are distributed. So, for example, when we are talking about Stuxnet, or when we are talking about any kind of hackers attacks, what's really dangerous with them is that once they attack a central point, we have central point of failure. So once the center is attacked, you kind of lock all the data. What distributed ledger technology produces or introduces to this field is that we don't have a center anymore. It's not only distributed, it's also decentralized. So having decentralization means that you have to have some sort of consensus protocols, because now you have anonymous players in the ground and they have to have some sort of communication. So when we talk about blockchain, you have these actors validating the transactions. How they validate those transactions, you have different kind of consensus. Right now, the two most known are the proof of work and the proof of stake consensus. So based on those consensus, we know which validators are validating the transactions. Now, besides anonymity, the immutability of the blockchains are kind of a characteristic that is important as well. Because presenting this consensus mechanism, it makes the transactions put into blocks, and it's immutable because you can't really change it. Once you have those data on block, that means that if we put our personal data in blocks or on blockchain, that means that once it's transcribed on the block, in the blockchain, it can be changed. That's a benefit as well as the negative part of it, because with the anonymity and with the distribution and decentralization of data, people are becoming aware that this could be used wherever. So there's a lot of businesses introducing the blockchain idea, and there's a lot of misconceptions. First is that blockchain is going to save the world. It's not really. It can be used, and it can be used for your business model, but you have to think what are the differences between the blockchain and just a ledger, which could be in Excel or, for example, the cloud. So when you talk about the immutability, and for example, when we are talking about the distributed ledger, for example, the land registry, we have to be aware of the fact that the land registries are actually changing all the time. So using a technology that is immutable is presenting a new question. So how are we having the immutability and still wanting to change the data that is being recorded? One of the things that distributed ledger technologies is also presenting is that they're getting rid of the double spending problem. So that's why it's been used in the financial sector so well, because once these transactions are written on the blockchain, you can't really have it written twice. You have different kind of blockchains or distributed ledgers. One is permissioned and one is permissionless. Permissionless actually means that there are multiple actors that can come to the blockchain and create or validate those transactions. Permissioned means that you actually have a center or somebody that tells you who those actors can be. That's also one of the characteristics going to decentralized and distributed, and trustless. So what these ledgers are presenting is that we can all work together based on consensus protocols without even knowing who we are. This is anonymity, and this means that we are kind of operating on a trustless basis. I'm kind of against that narrative because it's not really trustless. We just decided that instead of trusting the people we work with, we are trusting the code behind it. So half year ago, this is where it gets really tough for all the lawyers in blockchain industry. The industry itself is changing rapidly. So when we are talking about this being a new technology, yes, it's been introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008. But there's been a lot of changes. It's been introduced by Satoshi, and that was the emergence of Bitcoin and blockchain. But then again, we had Ethereum blockchain. Then again, we had Ripple. Then again, we had Neo, which is a Chinese one. And they all work on the same basis, but a bit differently. And for example, Ethereum blockchain introduced another kind of smart contract applications, and these are ICOs. It's basically just the initial coin offering, and what it means is that you can, from now on, collect all the funds, just like the venture capitalists or just like the startups who are collecting them, but with virtual currencies. What it actually presents is that it applies the smart contracts. Those are not the contracts in legal terms, but just the automated processes. So whatever I decide to put in the contract, which is just a program, a code, it's going to be automized. So once I transfer the virtual currency to the company that is conducting the ICOs, in regards to that virtual currency, I'm going to get a token. This token can have several functions. It can be a utilization. It can be used on the platform, just like the gaming industry is, for example, using their own game tokens. Or it could just be another currency. Is it secure or is it not? Blockchain itself, because of the immutability and because of its characteristic, cannot really be changed, cannot really be hacked. But just using this is not enough, because there has been several occasions where we still heard about exchanges being hacked, or for example, tokens being collected or being stolen from us. And what that means is that if you're using the blockchain technology, it doesn't really mean that you are secured per se. So, for example, exchanges are collecting a lot of funds from whomever is transacting on the exchange, but they can still have all those funds collected in one central point. So whomever knows how to hack that central point is still going to go or introduce some security weaknesses. Why it could be secured, or why it could be used in cyber cyber menace, is because it's traceable. So once we have all these transactions on the blockchain, you can trace it back to whomever made that transaction. You can use the public keys and the timestamp. So you have the digital signed transactions and the timestamp, and you can trace it back to whomever produced it. There is also another security issue when it comes to distributed ledgers, and that is the 51% attack. It means that once you have the blockchain introduced, and once you have the community that decides that they want to change the consensus protocol, if you have 51% of the blockchain actors deciding that they want to change it, it's possible to fork it. That means, in terms of cryptocurrencies, that there's going to be another currency introduced in the system. Future applications of the blockchain for NATO or for anyone dealing with supply chains, logistics, procurement and finance and messaging, that cannot be introduced only in non-governmental business sector, but also in the public sector. Cyber challenges, well, there are cyber securities. I've seen that NATO was actually conducting a competition, sort of, or they were having some talks with one of the companies introducing the blockchain solutions for cybersecurity, but then when you dig deeper, you just see that they are using blockchain for conducting the ICO. That doesn't mean that they are using the blockchain for cybersecurity. That just literally means that they're using the blockchain for gathering all the means to gather all the funds. Also, there was one of the open questions, and that is strong cryptography considered as a weapon? So we are going to hear about the cybersecurity in space. That's one of the big issues. Are we sending the satellites in space, and are they considered to be weapons? Can we attack with blockchains? And also the governance. So when it comes to distributed ledgers, governance is a big issue, because even though we have consensus protocols, there are developers working on it. So every time there is another solution presented to this community, there has to be some sort of protocols or governance systems on how these people are talking amongst them and how new solutions are presented. And just for the end, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. That was said by Benjamin Franklin already. So thank you.
Anja, thank you very much for giving on the insights on introduction on blockchain. Actually, thank you for the information also about the NATO projects at the moment. For example, there's a NATO think tank working on the cybersecurity environment located in Tallinn, and they are analyzing how we can use the blockchain technology in the NATO sphere, but also not only for defensive purposes, of course, I don't want to say for the offensive purposes, but how we can also, for example, secure the data communication with the Eurofighter and things like that, because, again, the Eurofighter is not able to fly when all the computer systems are down aerodynamically. That brings us actually to the next topic when it comes to the question if we are using, let's say, cyber means to intervene with the operations of military and where the threshold is legal-wise to talk about things. Oh, tut mir leid, ich habe in Englisch angefangen. Never mind. Wenn es die Frage geht, wie wir...
So, what about the legal barriers, Article 5, and so on and so forth? Now, you've been a military man, but you've also spent some time outside the military. So you know all about hybridity. So why don't you tell us what the future will hold in store for us? Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for these words of introduction. Now, thanks for having invited me. This is an honor and privilege for me. And I'd like to out myself. I'm a migrant. I'm a digital immigrant. Now, when I grew up, things were different. At the time, we didn't really talk about cyber or data processing or anything else. We actually used phones, the phone booth in front of the barracks to make phone calls. Well, this is inconceivable today. I'm also an immigrant. And I'm committed to the cyber notion. Cyber is something new and interesting. Now, we're talking about a constellation here, which has not really been elucidated. And we just take a look at this panel here. There are old and young panelists, especially two women, and I would like there to see more female presence, a greater female presence here at the conference. So this constellation is new and innovative, just like cyber. Now, cyber, of course, is a buzzword, but we've heard it several times. Cyber also has sort of an important sub-meaning, if you like. Now, I've been working in the area of information processing for 45 years. Last year, we celebrated our anniversary in Munich, 50-year anniversary, or ICT anniversary. So, we're talking about strategies, strategic communication, and we also talk about data processing, automated data processing, data automation. Then it was called electronic data processing. So, there was a focus on data. Bits, zeros and ones, sequences of bits. We were able to understand that. But then things changed in the 1970s, and there was suddenly the processing of information. In 1972, people started talking about computer science at the University of Neubiberg in Munich. And then people said, well, what should we call this area? Should it be called computer science or Informatik in Germany, informatics? So there were two different schools of thought. Well, people opted for informatics, because an emphasis was placed on information. Information for the users that could generate this information from the data. Now, we were talking about cyber. Now, cyber as a buzzword has existed for a long time and actually comes from the movie business. cyberborgs. But I followed discussions with the NATO over the past few years, as well as within the area of the Bundeswehr. General Militat talked about the Cyber and Information Space Command. So cyberspace and information space. So is there a difference between the information space and the cyberspace? Well, the cyberspace is a space, and here I tie in with the beginning of the conference, and Patrick also mentioned this. It's a space of control. So the question is, who actually wants to control? Who is to be controlled? How openly, how legally, how legitimately, and how pragmatically do we carry out this control? Well, I don't want to answer this question, just want to raise this question. So, based on this narrative of control, you come up with different associations than by saying that this is an information space without any values, devoid of any values. So let me stick to the information space concept, as was done by Mr. Schmiele yesterday. So, information to be distributed, simply. Well, that's also new in one respect, because in real time and simultaneously, various areas of life, of our statehood, can be connected, and I'm dependent on that. Business has already been mentioned. Our economies are dependent on this information to be exchanged among the market actors or players until the information trickles down to us as consumers. So I'm talking about consumers here, not citizens. I'm talking about consumers, even though it's hard to draw the line in this new world. So then the General Data Protection Regulation came into force, as we all know. So I've received a lot of information lately. Now it's about implementing the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's about me approving this. I need to do this explicitly. So if you try not to do this, not to approve this, well, then you can no longer use the functionalities. But what about my rights as a market participant who's able to negotiate things? So we clearly are dependent on all of these factors. Now, let's look at the overarching concept of devising strategies. Let's talk about dependencies. These dependencies exist regarding the economies and the consumers. But just think about utilities, healthcare, energy. All of this also displays a great deal of dependence. So the question is, how do I deal with this? How do I manage these things? And without the processing of information, without this information space, nothing will ever work in our civilized societies. Let me say this quite clearly. Now, we may also mention terrorists and criminals that may cause and wreak havoc, and I need to take countermeasures. Well, that's not the point. Every single technical system, every ICT system is made up of a plethora of components. So do they all work? I don't think that that is very likely. So, what about a real-life scenario? In a real-life scenario, we cannot have access to every single component or element, and sometimes we don't want to have access to every single component. We've all had this experience. Just think about making phone calls. Sometimes we've reached capacity limits, and then we just need to make phone calls later. Well, if this happens in critical situations, things become, well, critical.
I think it was last year in Munich that we were faced with such a situation where a criminal, and I'm calling him a criminal quite consciously, he went to McDonald's and, well, there was a shootout, people died at the McDonald's restaurant, and there was so much hysteria in the general public that the social media all of a sudden also, well, reported shots being fired elsewhere in Munich. And this led to an incredible well, not panic, but panic-like reaction of both the population and also the executive. Now, all of that, of course, needs to be considered when we talk about strategies for the future, because there's something else. Cyberspace, and I'm talking about cyberspace that you want to control, but now the objective of the control is us people. So this becomes tangible and can be experienced through our smartphone. It contains sensors. We're always telling other people where we are and what we're doing through our smartphone that we carry around, and what's being spoken in our environment and what's said in our vicinity. So that's what happens with Alexa and similar devices. We are getting this into our homes, so that everybody we have the benefit to be able to access the great world of information. So it's about control, and control has to be possible. I just talked about what occurred in Munich. So what the police are thinking about doing is to switch off social media when things like that occur, with everything that that entails. But these are considerations that need to be considered when we talk about strategy. We just said that currently it is only people who are the targets. In future, we're going to have the Internet of Things. So there will be a lot more of robots, drones, unmanned automatic vehicles above water, below water, in the air. So this is not a fiction, that's reality. And we also have to think about a new system of ethics, a new ethos. How do we deal with the fact that these sensors and actuators actually can have an impact on the real world? Whether we're talking about a military task. Well, to me, and I've worked for a long time in connected security matters, but that's subordinate, because it's a security problem first and foremost, and we have a big problem of domestic and external security, and we need to reconcile those two worlds, and we need to do this also at the level of organizations, not only at the level of the individual. So in Germany we have a debate between the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Defense. Who is in charge of cyber defense? It's not yet decided. Even the CER command has not covered that. This question is still open. What's interesting is that at the same time as the CIR command has been built up, there are two other things. So in the ministry, they formed a unit on cyber information technology, CIT. So the roles and responsibilities have not been clearly assigned. So this creates new interfaces. And secondly, in the framework of this reform, something entirely new was formed. I was in favor of innovation, of course. It's the so-called Cyber Reserve. Cyber Reserve in Germany is an idea that was born from the necessity to have cyber experts somewhere. And we need to, well, convince them to join the army or to work in any state organization and to, well, make do with the little money that you can earn there. This concept of the cyber reserve is something that is open to everybody. So everybody can commit himself or herself for a certain contractual period to do something for a certain period of time. So this is a free market. And whenever the need arises, in case of a cyber event, these people can be called upon. So basically that's a great thing. But it also entails certain risks. Because whoever you train in those matters, and you train them to react and to also work on the offensive, So you distribute the knowledge about how to influence other systems. And this is a risk that everybody should be aware of. And when it comes to developing a strategy, what this means that in future we're going to have more people who, for whatever reasons, are capable to produce a huge effect with limited means. And this takes me to a point where we also need to talk about not only these various aspects when it comes to developing a strategy, but we also need to cover the different areas that need to be expanded in order to not only include politicians and the military. How do we provide advice to politicians? Because we have more and more data exchange between cyber, the political field, the chat rooms. So we don't even know what's going on and who controls what and why. You can't get a big picture. So it would be fictitious to believe that you know what's happening there. I would like to thank our Israeli colleague, because apart from business, politics, we're also focusing on the citizen, and we're involving the citizen. Respect the common people. So if the citizens don't play along, if they're not convinced why they should be involved or participate, especially when it comes to those interdependencies, I think there will be a problem of acceptance. And this leads me to my conclusions. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Dankeschön fürs Mikro. Auffällig ist, Cyber in dieser Form ist Neuland. Das Neuland sieht man in
Thank you very
Form,
much for switching on the microphone.
dessen, was für ein buntes Panel wir haben. Wir sehen das anhand dessen,
Cyber
Akteure,
is uncharted territory. It is uncharted territory, and we see this based on the panel here, the panelists, actors that we didn't have to deal with in the past. There was always a clear delimitation who's in charge of what. Now all of these things need to be re-identified, reassigned and reoriented. And I hope with the help of this panel we've been able to show that we're still at the beginning. We have methods that we can use, we have experience, but still, what I noticed, since I also gave you my own take, where I showed you that cyber is in the middle of the classical warfare areas. Well, I'm saying it's also a virtual area that we can't capture physically, so our sovereignty and territorial matters will not be affected by that. But on the other hand, as the panelists said, we are so dependent on this virtual world and flows of data, so it is completely unthinkable to work with that. So I hope that this panel has been able to give you an insight, and I'm now looking forward to the round of Q&A. Oh, we already have a first question. Please wait for the mic. Good morning. Thank you for your presentations. I have a question for Colonel Unger, Colonel Hermanns and Ms. Fröhlich, because they covered the subject matter. The question is about a certain level of autonomy. So how can the nation states become autonomous or self-sufficient in cyber matters? On the other hand, we are also a member of the European Union. There's a cyber strategy 2013 and 2017. So the objective being to come up with a common concept for cybersecurity at the level of the EU, to have a strong EU agency for cybersecurity, that's the intention, and an EU-wide certification for cybersecurity is the goal. So how do we participate in this at the level of Austria? And Mr. Unger, Colonel Unger, a very unpleasant question for you. How can we find in the cyber world whether you're under attack and whether the competences that lie with the Ministry of the Interior now are suddenly switched to the Department of Defense? I guess that it's not necessary or not possible for politicians to intervene in this short period of time of this transfer of powers.
Dank für die spannenden Fragen. Wie viele Stunden habe ich jetzt Zeit?
Well, thank you for the interesting questions.
Autonomie
How many hours do I have?
Wenn wir schauen an die 10 größten Firmen der Welt.
Well, technical autonomy or self-sufficiency is nice, but look at the 10 biggest companies. There are 6 internet giants, and none of them are European. There's just one big European company in Germany, SAP, that is still playing among the majors. And that's a fact that we're also seeing in Austria. They have so much money, these major companies, that anything that looks promising, they simply buy it. Some numbers: Apple has a cash flow of $260 billion. That's more than the market capitalization of the 4 biggest automotive manufacturers in Germany. So they might buy these 4 car makers if they wanted to. That's the real circumstances. We may have more know-how and innovative power here in Europe, but currently we're not capable of promoting this talent to turn it into European corporations. That would be a prerequisite for technical autonomy. I think that funding schemes exist, and it remains to be seen whether they will have a beneficial impact. The second comment: how can we see that we are under attack? Well, you can tell by the symptoms. So basically, the question arose when we had groups of hackers who apparently fought for Turkey and attacked our airport and ministries. So apparently there were private hackers who tried to do a little damage. So the question was, what will the military do? What will cyber defense do? Well, in this case, nothing at all, because this was an affair to be handled by the security police. So our sovereignty wasn't affected. Even if a hacker managed to shut off the power supply in Austria, which would lead to disastrous circumstances if the power outage were longer than a few hours, this would still be dealt with by the Ministry of the Interior, and we would provide support and assistance. So it would have to be a major disaster, so several structures would have to be affected simultaneously. And then, of course, it's a political decision how to deal with that. What we can contribute is that we can contribute our technical expertise and advise politicians to help them develop options. Lastly, it is the minister who decides whether he wants to call the case for the Department of Defense to come in, and then he will find instructions on what to do. Of course, you know the EU strategies. There's internal security. Here we are focused on the cybercrime competence centers or centers of excellence. Europol, for example, they have a focal point that also had an impact on our work. We have a center of excellence for cybercrime with very strong HR equipment, all the way down to the various criminal offices. We have experts in defense. There are several initiatives, joint procurement, training, etc. As far as strengthening European levels are concerned, there's ENISA, based in Greece, and they have been reinforced repeatedly, yet again, very recently, and this European security standard recommendations have been drafted by them, and that was also the basis, and still is the basis, for the development of the Austrian security standard. So we try to make it comparable, to make sure that we can also compare the results of the audit. And I would like to hand over to my colleagues. Very briefly, as to the question of the autonomy of individual countries, I talked about international space law. It's about making sure that all the countries that are signatory to this treaty are authorized to exercise their rights. Of course, We want to make sure that the entire international community becomes a member of this treaty. It's about 100 so far, so not all UN members have signed up, but normally it is beneficial if every single state were to ratify this space treaty. As to questions of autonomy, where I'm talking about the cyberspace, right? The information space. Very difficult question, very hard to answer. Now, if you were to assume, the way I've experienced it in various deployments, that we have to use the general information space because we don't have our autonomous information space, this will lead to problems. It causes problems in various respects, not only military problems. We talk about this overarching concept of security, because that doesn't ensure the ability of civil society to survive. Now I can lean back after this morning's presentation given by Mr. Berg and say that this isn't a military problem, it's not a political problem either, because the narrative of growth and prosperity is part of the economy, so it is business groups that need to deal with that. Well, that wouldn't really be enough. It's about what the EU, or what we understand by Europe, or a coalition of the willing, whether we want to build up an autonomous information and cyberspace where we determine ourselves what is being controlled, in order to put it in neutral terms. Or, and this is based on my own personal observation, that we have already become so dependent on one nation, which is clearly saying, and I think now Trump has put it in even more blunt terms, America first. And what this means is what I experienced during my time in the military on the occasion of different incidents. Therefore, when it comes to developing a strategy for the future, I would recommend that the question of autonomy should be examined in more detail. And I'd like to close on that note. I think we can have one more question. Meanwhile, as to NATO and cyber, NATO are coming up with more strategies. The military committee, there's the force protection, where we are talking about cyber at the tactical level. Then there's a new document that is to be implemented soon. And the next NATO summit will come up with a new narrative. So this will be worked off as well. Another question. I have a question for Colonel Unger. In your presentation, you quoted 5 levels of a threat scenario, starting with the threat against individuals, and in the end it was the digital standstill. So as far as I understood this, there's also an interplay of domestic security and national defense. So to what extent are the judiciary involved as far as cybersecurity is concerned? So I normally deal with stages 1 and 2 of this range of threats that you quoted, and I have the impression that the judiciary is not really very much involved, so there isn't really an exchange of know-how as far as risks for individuals are concerned. So maybe the know-how that already exists at the level of the Department of Defense, well, I think we should have a stronger exchange with the judiciary, even though this is only at the national level. Thank you for this question. In my articles, I always write it is the judiciary and the enforcement authorities. I'm always talking about police and justice. So, of course, it is desirable to involve all citizens because everybody is affected by the cyber world. So we should start at elementary school. Some schools are actually doing that, but in most parts it hasn't materialized yet. Now the military, of course, they're doing a lot in Austria, and based on our profession we need to look ahead. What is the worst case? So we need to think in strategic terms, we need to think ahead for decades. Sometimes things materialize sooner than elsewhere. But of course, the main defense is to defend our country, and we cannot be the master of or the tutor of the entire nation. Of course, we make our contribution, our information offer is available for everybody, our conferences are open to everybody, and also the Ministry of Justice. Of course, we had been invited by a minister who asked us to verify and audit in security to prevent public secrets from being divulged to the public. So there is a cooperation between the various ministries, but I can't really tell you what the overall situation is like in the judiciary. So I don't really know enough about that. Well, I'm very pleased about the large number of questions. Unfortunately, I have to end the discussion at this point. It's good that people are interested in continuing the debate, maybe during the break, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation as well, of course. So I would like to thank all our panelists, and I'd like to hand back to Brigadier Paschel. Thank you.
Ich darf mich bei dem Panel zunächst einmal für die exzellente Panelleitung, für die Vorbereitung, auch für die Zusammenstellung der Vortragenden.
I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you for the facilitator, the excellent preparation. Thank you, Mr. OKeefe, for having prepared the panel. I'd like to thank the speakers for the excellent presentations. I can't really comment on the technical details, it's been detailed enough. There are 2 or 3 meta consequences that show why cyber fits in quite well in this strategy conference. The first meta analysis is that, as we've heard from Ms. Fröhlich, we are embedded in an international context. We're talking about space, maritime areas, so we need a global strategy, the larger context. So this is part of strategy. You can't do this on your own. Secondly, it turns out, as the last speaker said, there's this triangle of politics, military, and domestic and foreign policy. So we need a coordination within the country, within the state. So we need, without a military connotation, we need a staff immediately below the government level that ensures that there's a strategy across different ministries, where we have joint cyber measures that are defined. And since cyber is primarily seen as a threat, as opposed to normal crimes that also happen in isolation in Austria, but this can have an area-wide impact. So this is a basic threat, which, when it comes to assessing the risk, well, the military could provide such a risk assessment, and this could be the basis of political decision-making, and politicians would have to decide based on a well-founded documentary evidence provided by the military. That doesn't mean that the military is the school of the entire nation. We don't have to train every school child in cyber matters, and that doesn't mean that we are in charge of all failures of computer systems, and that doesn't mean that with the means of our limited budget, we can be used for anti-cyber warfare. But I think that cyber is a holistic threat, so the danger lies in this overall dimension, the holistic dimension, and that is easier for the military to assess. And if we had such a staff, an interdisciplinary staff across different ministries, we could maybe also find a pan-national solution without any frictions between the ministries. So that is relevant in terms of strategy. That's a consequence of this cyber panel. Thank you very much. And as a token of our gratitude, every one of you, and let me start with the facilitator of this panel. That's our strategy wine. If you have to fly and you can't put it in your suitcase, you have to drink it right away. Thank you.